or things in the chat that gets captured. The polls do not get captured, so they are anonymous. Okay. So this is the book that we are talking about today, Think Again by Adam Grant. And I really think this book is a great series of lessons in intellectual humility. The book is rich with wisdom. And so what I want you to know is that we are barely dipping one toe into the material. I'd encourage you to get a copy of the book. I know it's in the local libraries. You can also get it from your local bookstore. So I want to mention that we have 2 previous lunch and learns that have a tie into the material that we are talking about today. So if you're interested, earlier this fall, my colleague Jerry Hauser presented on Dances with Foes, which is a presentation built on a chapter in this book. In addition, last fall, I presented on the research of Nobel Laureate Daniel Kahnemann, and Kahnemann provides the foundation for much of the work that Grant is doing. The name of that lunch and learn was Things Aren't Always As They Seem. So it's a kind of an introduction to Kahnemann's work, certainly not comprehensive. He has done so much. But Kahnemann explored how we think as human beings, and he identified many of the thinking errors we all succumb to. So this book, Think Again, is a summary of research that attempts to figure out how to avoid thinking errors. I encourage you to watch the recordings of the previous sessions if you are interested. So I'm going to start here with a poll so that you should see it pop up on your screen. Have you ever had a difficult time changing your mind about something? Yes, no, or I'm always right, so there's no need. And since the poll's anonymous, you can be entirely honest. Okay, the answers are coming in about, I would say, anyone else that needs to vote? Okay, some still coming in. So, 97% is voting yes with a 3% for no. I'm going to just share my results here so you can see. That is typically borne out by the research. We have a difficult time changing our minds. So what happens if what we believe is erroneous? So I'm going to share a little video here. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Okay. All right, that means, I think I need to go back a step to optimize the sound for you, and my computer's not letting me go. That's not what I want. There we go. Let's try this again. Here we go. This is very strange. I've lost all my controls. Liz, can you see the second slide right now?
No, we just see the gallery of attendees.
Okay, so that is part of what's wrong. And not sure how I got myself into this. And let's try sharing the screen again. How about now?
Now we see it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
However, it's not in presentation mode, but I'm not
Yep.
sure which mode you want. Okay.
Yeah, turns out I had to get out of presentation mode to optimize for sound. And I don't know why, but it wouldn't let me do it. All right. So the topic was, it's hard for us to change our minds, and that doesn't change when we're wrong about something. So let's watch this little video to get us going.
So it's 1995, I'm in college, and a friend and I go on a road trip from Providence, Rhode Island to Portland, Oregon. And you know, we're young and unemployed, so we do the whole thing on back roads, through state parks and national forests, basically the longest route we can possibly take. And somewhere in the middle of South Dakota, I turn to my friend and I ask her a question that's been bothering me for 2,000 miles. What's up with the Chinese character I keep seeing by the side of the road? My friend looks at me totally blankly. There's actually a gentleman in the front row who's doing a perfect imitation of her look. And I'm like, you know, all the signs we keep seeing with the Chinese character on them. She just stares at me for a few moments. And then she cracks up because she figures out what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is this. Right. The famous Chinese character for picnic area.
Okay, sorry. I learned the hard way that I have to do it right away, or else my slides won't advance. So this is Catherine Schultz talking about being wrong, and she's written a book about that. She goes on to say that, you know, this is just one example of how to be wrong. She goes on to talk about what happens when we're wrong. How does it feel to be wrong? And so she posed this question to her audience, and I'm posing this to you now. How does it feel to be wrong? And just put in the chat what your feeling is when you're wrong. I have one answer, silly. Depends on who you're with, small. Feeling uncomfortable, not adequate, humiliating, embarrassing, humbling. And yeah, this is exactly the way I answered this question. So what's really interesting is Catherine Schultz goes on to say, and that's how the audience answered her as well. She goes on to say, these answers are actually answers to a different question. These answers are answers to how does it feel when you realize you're wrong. Her point is that how does it feel to be wrong? It feels like we're right because that's what we think, right? So I think this is an important place to start when we're exploring how to think again. Because in order to think again, you need to be able to, or at least willing to acknowledge that you could possibly be wrong. And unfortunately, according to Daniel Kahnemann's research, once we form opinions, once we think we know something, we are extremely reluctant to let go of our opinions and change our minds. So thinking is not easy for us. And you may know about the Dunning-Kruger effect. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And so having an erroneous opinion and not knowing that you have an erroneous opinion can lead to membership in the Dunning-Kruger Club. So this is a graph that illustrates this a little bit. So the figure here is graphing competency versus actual performance. And it's illustrating Dunning-Kruger, obviously. And so the green line is representing the actual test scores. Perceived ability is in blue. And the red line is representing, the red line up represents actual perceived test scores. Let me say that again. Perceived ability and perceived test scores are blue and red respectively, and actual test scores are green. So you can see that they're not lining up perfectly. In fact, there's quite a big discrepancy in the, in the less competent students on the left-hand side of the graph. And the less competent they are, the higher their perception of competency compared to their skill. The point where perception and reality converge is in the upper quarter of the third quartile. And then they diverge again, which is also interesting because it goes in the opposite direction with students in the top quartile underestimating their performance. And so I have definitely been guilty of having my perception of my performance be out of whack with my actual performance. In the chat, can you share a time that this has happened to you? And while you think about what you want to share, I'll share one that I had happen, which was a senior exam in French literature, which was my field of study as an undergraduate. We had a comprehensive exam at my university. And I was terrified because I did not think I could, pass this exam competently. But I did, and I did actually quite well. And I still to this day, there's a mental fog around how did I do that? Any examples that you've had about where your perceived ability did not line up with your actual ability in either direction? On a job interview? Yeah. First chem exam in college? Oh boy, yeah. Ping pong. College entrance exam? Oh yeah. One of my favorites is people new to actually skiing on mountains, and they've learned in some other environment, and they go to the top of the mountain and they try to come down at black. Okay, comps, yeah. So we've all experienced this, right? Great answers, thank you. So another way to represent this gap is with this graph. So if you've ever invested significant amount of time in learning something, you'll recognize these stages. You go from knowing nothing to overconfidence, discouragement, the beginning of real competence, and then finally knowing that there's so much more to know. And what's interesting to me is that this initial I know everything peak that you see on the graph has been dubbed Mount Stupid. And the reason they call it that is that, clearly people are speaking from inexperience and don't fully understand. And all you have to do is turn on social media and you see lots of people who are opening their keyboards and their mouths, and they're stuck on Mount Stupid. So a key strategy to avoid being stuck on Mount Stupid ourselves is being flexible enough to think again. So we're going to look at one aspect of our psychology that Grant sees as contributing to being stuck on Mount Stupid, either confidence or lack of confidence. It can go either way. So this graph is directly from the book, and you can see that people this is based again on research, on experiments, are divided into four quarters. So first of all, Grant does not see confidence and humility at odds with each other. He sees humility as being grounded, recognizing that all of us are flawed and fallible. And he sees confidence as a measure of how much you believe in yourself. We become blinded by arrogance. So that's the bottom left quarter. When we're utterly convinced of our strengths and our strategies. We get paralyzed by doubt when we lack conviction in both. That's the catty corner to the blind arrogance, is debilitating doubt. We can be consumed by an inferiority complex when we know the right method, but feel uncertain about our ability to execute it. So that's the obsessive inferiority on the left top. And what we all want is in the bottom right-hand corner, which is confident humility. So that means having faith in our capability while appreciating that we may not have the right solution or even be addressing the right problem. So this is what gives us enough doubt to re-examine our old knowledge and enough confidence to pursue new insights. So a tip from Grant is this: when adults have the confidence to acknowledge what they don't know, they pay more attention to how strong evidence is and spend more time reading material that contradicts their opinions. So that's something we can do to keep from getting stuck on Mount Stupid. So look at this joyful kid. I love the glee on the face of this child. So we're going to talk about the joy of being wrong. So in the chat, if you could just chat to me, have you ever experienced joy when you've realized you were wrong, and when did that occur? Just jot some things down in the chat. When I had worries that proved wrong. Yep. Thinking a deadline was sooner than it actually was. Oh my goodness, yes. When it works in your favor. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what if, you thought that your son was drunk, but he wasn't. So what if we approached every time we're wrong with the same way? Now, I can't say that I personally have reached this level of glee about being wrong, but I'm working on it. So Grant tells the story about presenting at a conference where Daniel Kahnemann was in attendance. So Daniel Kahnemann's his big hero. And after Grant's presentation, Kahnemann responded like this. And this is Grant's description. His eyes lit up and a huge grin appeared on his face. That was wonderful, he said. I was wrong. So later, Grant talked to Kahnemann about this. And Kahnemann explained that my attachment to my ideas is provisional. There's no unconditional love for them. So attachment is one of the things that keeps us from recognizing when our opinions are off the mark. So another tip is that we can cultivate non-attachment to our ideas as a strategy that allows us to reconsider our opinions and ultimately allows us to escape Mount Stupid. So this is a timeline that's also from Grant's book. And I really appreciate the light touch that he has here, with mistakes. There's no mea culpa, and there's no dramatic, huge, like, oh my gosh, I was wrong. There's no heaviness. It's, oops, I made a mistake. And then you can hear the joy in that very last bullet point. Wow, I knew less than I thought. That's an expression of joy. So another tip is that curiosity and willingness to explore will help us to think again. So let's go to an example that's sort of application of some of this a little bit. So we've all heard, if anyone who's grown up in the United States, I should say, has heard the adage, walk a mile in their shoes. If you have an adversary, or if you have someone you disagree with, walk a mile in their shoes before you judge them. Actually, research shows that that's not a good idea. So why is that? The example that Grant gives is a political one, which I think is really handy because we're in a politically polarized culture in the United States right now, so it's apt. So in experiments, when political opposites try to imagine the other's perspective, they failed to elicit insights. And he says, we fail because we're terrible mind readers and we're not very imaginative. So what to do instead? So the advice to walk in someone's shoes is perspective taking. We're imagining how they might feel or think. But he's encouraging perspective seeking. So I'm going to give you an example that shows how perspective seeking becomes critical when we're dealing with racial inequity. So I'm sure we all remember the incident in the spring of 2020 when an African-American bird watcher in Central Park was threatened by a white woman. His name is Christian Cooper. And he had politely asked the white woman to leash her dog, and because there was a leash law in effect, he started filming as she refused to leash her dog and she responded by saying she would call the police and, quote, tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. And then she proceeded to do that. Afterwards, the woman made the following statement, as I'm going to read from Grant's book now. She said, "I'm not racist. I didn't mean to harm that man in any way," she declared in her public apology. "I think I was just scared." The problem here, as Grant explains it, is her simple explanation overlooks the complex emotions that fueled her actions. She could have stopped to ask why she had been afraid. What views about Black men had led her to feel threatened in a very polite conversation. She could have paused to consider why she felt entitled to lie to the police. Interestingly, when Christian Cooper is asked whether he accepted her apology, he gives a much more nuanced reading of the situation. And I'm going to read the quote again here. He said, "I think her apology is sincere. I'm not sure if in that apology, she recognizes that while she may not be or consider herself racist, that particular act was definitely racist. Granted, it was a stressful situation, a sudden situation, maybe a moment of spectacularly poor judgment, but she went there. Is she a racist? I can't answer that. Only she can answer that. Going forward with how she conducts herself and how she chooses to reflect on the situation and examine it." Grant here is highlighting Christians' willingness to rethink the situation. And he goes on to say that it shouldn't be up to the victim to inject complexity into a difficult conversation. Rethinking should start with the offender. So Grant's tip here is that perspective taking does not work, but perspective seeking does. In other words, actually talking to people to gain insight into the nuances of their views. My opinion on this is that we really need more people in our society who are in positions of greater power relative to others to engage in perspective seeking, and especially when the power differences have to do with aspects of people's identities, such as race, that are innate. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation portion. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, so thanks, Liz, for noticing those chats that I didn't see. I love the chats that we've been getting today. Does anyone have questions for me about this topic, about the Ombuds office? You can just put something in the chat. I'd be happy to answer. So how can we change a racist perspective when they don't feel minorities are human? So this is why I think that Adam Grant is really trying to challenge people who are not in marginalized positions, people who are part of the cultural majority, to do the work of really understanding their own ideas and the positions that they hold. Because, this culture that we have, the more I've delved into the United States history, and I'm talking about the stuff that didn't get taught in junior high and high school, where I learned it, there are some serious flaws in our country in terms of how we have been taught to think about things, especially around race. And I think it's incumbent on those who are comfortable and who benefit from the situation to investigate their own thinking and see if they can find a way to think again and really take into account the perspectives of those who are marginalized in our current society. Great question, thank you. Other questions? Go ahead and pop them in the chat. Thanks for putting the book link in the chat again. And this book is in the local libraries, by the way. I like to use the libraries. So Teresa, if you're interested in the book, you should be able to get it from the library. It came out last March, so I doubt that there's a long waiting list anymore. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, observations? And so this last example was definitely a stressful situation. I do want to point to what Liz put in the chat. We're going to have a series of lunch and learns on heart math, which is a program that teaches you practical things you can do to increase your resilience when you're in a stressful situation. Oh, thanks for the tip, Caitlin. They have it. They have the book digitally. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Adam Grant's work, his other books as well. And I think, honestly, part of the reason is that he's willing to admit he was wrong. And he goes back and says, hey, when I wrote that book or wrote that article, I was wrong. I didn't get it right. Here's what I think now. And I really respect that. Well, we're about at time. If anyone else has a burning question, please pop it in the chat. I would love to answer any questions you have, but I know you all need to get to the rest of your lunch. Thank you. I appreciate your thanks. It was nice to see you all here. Thanks for being here. Oh, the TED Talk. That was Catherine Schultz. If you Google Ted and Catherine Schultz, it comes up. You're welcome, Susan.